Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is a good afternoon. Don't look out behind you. No, do look out behind you. It's quite beautiful. But I do thank you especially for coming today. I know it will be worth your while, and just enjoy it. Some of you in the room have met and heard from Brent Glass before, and join me in welcoming him back to the Schemmel Forum. Brent is a consummate public scholar and historian whose research, creativity, and planning result in programs and institutions that we can all enjoy. Well, some of them we can enjoy. He takes on institutions to make them better than they were, and at present he's involved in the process of creating a museum. Brent has, as long as I've known him, he's been involved in creating and directing institutions and projects that make a difference in their communities, and I would say often in the world. We have been friends and colleagues for many years. We served our respective state humanities councils. He is executive director in North Carolina, and I as chair in Pennsylvania. We both worked in the Governor Casey administration. He was head of the Historical and Museum Commission, and I was cultural advisor to the governor. Our offices were just a few feet away from each other. Then we both landed in Washington about the same time. I was at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he as director of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. In every case, Brent took the institution he served to new heights. As Director Emeritus of the American History Museum, he has developed a global reputation as a consultant, having been an advisor to museums on most continents. Now, closer to home, he is consultant to the Sing Sing Prison Museum, which he will talk about today. Please welcome him to the podium.
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank the University of Scranton for hosting this forum. I understand it has a very rich history. I remember speaking here several years ago, and it's been great to see how the quality just continues to grow, and I'm very honored to be invited back. I want to thank Sandra Myers and Maury Myers, good friends. It's great to see them again, and for their hospitality. I want to also thank Allison Morrison, who behind the scenes makes all this happen and is so accommodating and effective in what she does. I have to say that I never take honors for granted. I learned very early in my career to savor every honor you get, so to be a speaker here at the forum is a great honor. When I was just starting in my career in North Carolina, I was invited to speak to a historical society, County Historical Society, and as their keynote speaker for their annual meeting. And after the talk, they gave me a lifetime membership in the society. And at that time, that was really worth something for me because I was much younger. But then about a year later, I received a letter that said, "Your lifetime membership is expired." So I've always taken these honors not for granted. I really savor them because you never know when they're going to be withdrawn. So actually this afternoon we have a serious topic to talk about, and I don't know about you, but I was largely ignorant of the history of criminal justice. Coming through and have a Ph.D. in history from the University of North Carolina, I feel with all the scholarship and also the public history work that I've done that Sandra has mentioned, that I would have become more aware of the history of criminal justice. And I had some familiarity with Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, but I didn't really understand the significance as much as I have in the last 3.5, almost 4 years since I've been working with people in Ossining, New York, to develop a museum at Sing Sing Prison. And the topic is both timeless and timely. You cannot pick up a newspaper today without reading something about an issue concerning criminal justice. We were just talking at lunch about bail reform. There's the issues of sentencing, of conditions in prison, of parole, of the whole question about whether rehabilitation is possible, whether education in prison is desirable. These issues pop up all the time. And my belief is that history is a resource that helps us understand our own times and our own lives. In this case, I think the history of criminal justice illuminates many of the issues that we read about today. These issues didn't just happen overnight. Many of these issues go back to the beginnings of the U.S. Republic and even are older than that. Many of these issues, you can read the Bible and see issues of crime and punishment that come up regularly. So this is an enduring issue. The issues about justice, freedom, punishment, rehabilitation. And then in a democracy, there are fundamental questions in the U.S. about our political, social, and cultural structure and systems. So what I want to do is show you a few images about the history of Sing Sing, talk about the museum we're trying to develop, and then I hope with all the interest that I've heard already before the program, that we have a lively discussion. I don't think, from the people I've met, I don't think people are going to hold back, but I hope we can raise some questions, not only about criminal justice, but about the value of studying the history of criminal justice and presenting it in the form of a museum. Now, Sing Sing Prison, as I said, is located in Ossining, New York, and Sing Sing lends itself to a number of cliches and popularization, and we want to get beyond that. But this marker is something you see as soon as you get to the entrance to Sing Sing. The term up the river, the big house, the last mile, the house of fear, all those terms are associated with Sing Sing. But our goal is to make this the best museum about prisons and criminal justice in the country. And to do that, we want to take the topic seriously, not trivialize the topic, not sensationalize the subject, and really engage visitors in a serious way in the issues of criminal justice. This building, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but this is the heart of the museum. This cell block was built in 1825 by prisoners who came down the Hudson River from Auburn, New York, and built this extraordinary building that measures 476 feet long, about 6 cell blocks high, and about 50 feet across, and at one time housed 1,200 prisoners. The plans for this cell block are in several libraries. The New York Historical Society has a copy of these plans, and so does the Ossining County Historical Society. And one of the issues we will talk about is the architecture of incarceration. For most of the early American history, punishment was a public affair. People were punished, often flogged, or made to be put in humiliating circumstances in public. Later on, the idea of privatizing or making punishment, removing it from public view, became the approach. In New York City, the first state prison was called Newgate, and it was in Greenwich Village. It was that actually is when the first term up the river became common, because the prison was located a little bit further up the river from Lower Manhattan, where most people lived and where most of the city activity took place. But that real estate became too valuable, and so the next prison in 1816 was in Auburn, New York, and that prison is still operating today. And Auburn is an interesting town. I'll just take a little digression here. Harriet Tubman spent the last 50 years of her life in Auburn, New York. William Seward, the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, lived there in Auburn. His house is a house museum there. The Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, grew up in Auburn, New York. Auburn is only a few miles from Seneca Falls, New York, which is where the Women's Rights Convention took place. So that area is quite interesting. There's one other notable native of Auburn, New York, who you'll meet in a few minutes in this program. Now, why was Sing Sing chosen? Why was that site chosen? Auburn was too far from New York City, and as New York City grew, most of the people who were sentenced to prison were coming from New York City. So they tried to find a site that was closer to the city itself. Sing Sing happened to be a place where there was this enormous limestone quarry. And the word Sing Sing in the local Indian dialect meant stone on stone. So this enormous quarry was used not only to build the cell block that I showed you earlier, but Sing Sing marble was used in a number of buildings in Manhattan and in Westchester County. And in fact, that was one of the ways that the prison paid for itself. The prisoners were constantly quarrying rock that was used for construction purposes up and down the Hudson River. Here is another view of the 1825 cell block. And I have to say that I've been in this building, in this ruin, many, many times, and it never fails to be an awesome experience. There's something very haunting about being in this space, knowing the history, knowing how 1,200 men, and for a short period of time there was also a section for women, lived in very Spartan conditions in that building. The original cells were 3 feet 3 inches wide, 7 feet long, and almost 6.5 feet high. It's no bigger than a yoga mat. And this is where the prisoners spent their evening hours. During the daytime, they were out working, quarrying rock, and doing other kinds of jobs. The Sing Sing system, which was called the Auburn system or Congregate system of labor, was one form of punishment and one form of the penal philosophy. The idea was to have prisoners working together in groups in silence and then return to their cells in the evening. This was a difference from the solitary confinement system that was practiced in Philadelphia at Eastern State Penitentiary. And what you see here is the view of Eastern State, which had a hub and spoke system where each prisoner had their own cell, much larger than the one that you saw from Sing Sing. But the Quakers who developed Eastern State Penitentiary had the philosophy that if we were alone in our cells and had a chance to repent, that's where the word penitentiary comes from, if we had the chance to repent and get in touch with our good selves, we would be rehabilitated. Now, the evidence was to the contrary, that this had a very deleterious effect on people who were incarcerated at Eastern State. But for many years, this debate between solitary confinement and the congregate system of labor was a big debate, not only in the United States, but people from all over the world came to the United States to study how this relatively new democracy was implementing the philosophy of punishment for criminals. At Sing Sing, the first warden was a man named Elam Linz, and he came from Auburn as well. He was a former Navy captain, and so he transferred a number of the Navy practices, corporal practices, into the regime at Sing Sing. And when observers came to Sing Sing or Auburn and met Elam Linz, they were shocked by his use of corporal punishment, but he was very, very free to talk about it and even brag about it. And so Sing Sing became very early on, notorious for its systems of corporal punishment. Now, in 1831, a very famous visitor came to Sing Sing, Alexis de Tocqueville. Many of you have probably read, or were assigned at least, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America by de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont. They spent several weeks in Ossining, or in Sing Sing. At that time, the town was still called Sing Sing. The town was actually incorporated before the prison was established. So the town of Sing Sing is about 15 years older than the prison. We'll get into why they changed their name a little bit later. But de Tocqueville was very interested in the American system of justice and whether he could bring back any ideas to France and incorporate those ideas. Only later did he decide to write a larger study which was called Democracy in America. But the first reason he came to the United States was to study the prison system. But he concluded that while the society in the United States gives the example of the most extended liberty, the prisons of the same country offered the spectacle of the most complete despotism. So he did not have a favorable review. Later, Charles Dickens visited Eastern State Penitentiary and had an equally negative view of the prison system. Now, I mentioned earlier that there were women who were incarcerated at Sing Sing. The first women's prison in the United States was at Sing Sing, and the first building built for women, a state prison, I should say, was at Sing Sing and operated from 1839 to 1877, when it was then moved to Bedford Hills. And if any of you are from New York State or know the New York State system, Bedford Hills is still the women's prison in New York. If you notice up at the top of this image here, a very handsome Greek Revival building was built for the women's prison. That building is no longer there. One of the early matrons of the Sing Sing Women's Prison, and I should back up and say originally that part of the Sing Sing village was called Mount Pleasant. So sometimes you will see drawings or articles or references, maps that call the prison Mount Pleasant. So name changes are something that for historians are interesting to track and why those changes were made. So in the 1830s and 40s, it was still called Mount Pleasant. Eliza Farnham was brought in because the women's prison was so difficult to manage that they wanted to bring someone in who had different ideas. And she was a transcendentalist. She was influenced by Margaret Fuller and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Margaret Fuller actually visited the women's prison at Sing Sing and wrote about it. And she was also a phrenologist, which was a pseudoscience in the 19th century, where it was believed if you could feel the outlines and the features of someone's skull, you could determine their behavior. But she also instituted a much more humane discipline in the women's prison, and the violence and mayhem that was associated with the women's prison went way down during her tenure. However, she was considered so radical that she was removed only after a few years of being the matron at Sing Sing. And this is a pattern we'll see, that when reformers come in with ideas that are a little bit different, there's resistance. That's nothing new today, but it goes back to my point that all the ideas that we read about now to reform prisons, there are precedents for it, and we'll talk about that in a moment. By the late 19th century, Sing Sing became an attraction for the local press. The New York media was starting to grow in the 19th century. You have the tabloid press growing in popularity. Later, radio and TV and movies come along, and the people who were incarcerated at Sing Sing, the great escapes, the violence that occurred regularly in the prison, were just catnip for the press. And so the New York Times, in fact, had a regular journalist, a regular writer, assigned just to Sing Sing, just to cover the colorful characters who were incarcerated there, some of the problems that occurred there, the great escapes. So Sing Sing developed its notoriety, especially during this late 19th century period. It also became a place where, because of the growth of labor unions, the labor unions in the 19th century started to grow in New York City and started to complain about the cheap labor that was competing with their work, the cheap labor of the prison labor at the New York State prisons. So gradually, many of the jobs and many of the activities that the prisoners were doing were taken away, and they just had more idle time, and it really produced more conflict and more violence. In 1891, the first executions took place at Sing Sing, and this is when the village of Sing Sing started to become very sensitive about not wanting to be associated with capital punishment. And so they petitioned the legislature. Finally, around 1900, 1901, the New York State legislature changed the name of the village from Sing Sing to Ossining. So we went from Mount Pleasant for the prison. The prison continued to be called Sing Sing Prison. The electric chair, the state electric chair was, electrocutions were practiced at 3 state prisons, but by the 1920s, all executions took place at Sing Sing. 614 people died in the electric chair at Sing Sing from 1891 to 1963. 8 were women. This was another reason why Sing Sing became notorious, was that on almost a regular basis, there would be an execution, and this was covered in the press. One of the most celebrated executions were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. They were sentenced to, they were the only people ever executed for espionage in American history. They were sentenced in 1951, so they spent 2 years on death row at Sing Sing Prison. And that building where the executions took place is still there at Sing Sing. It's been changed. Its purpose is now a vocational training program, but the building is still there. The last person executed at Sing Sing was Eddie Lee Mays, and he was put to death in the electric chair in 1963. So when I talk about every chapter in the history of criminal justice has a few pages written at Sing Sing, I think you can already see these issues of the architecture of confinement, the life conditions in prison, capital punishment, women's history. All these issues have a few pages written at Sing Sing. Now, in the early 20th century, there were some reforms implemented. The prisoners no longer had to wear striped uniforms. They didn't have to march in lockstep, where they had to hold on. In the past, they held on to the prisoner's belt in front of them and walked around the prison in lockstep. They no longer had to do that. There was more recreation offered. The real leader of that reform movement was a man named Thomas Mott Osborne, and he was from Auburn as well. In fact, there's a statue of Osborne in front of the police station in Auburn, New York. Now, he was a descendant of Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott from Philadelphia, a leading reformer, an abolitionist, a suffragette, also very instrumental in prison reform. He was a great nephew of Lucretia Mott. So there was this history in the Osborne family of reform and progressive thinking. And he also, if any of you are familiar with the Osborne Association, which is based in New York City, which works now with reentry programs for prisoners, especially housing. The Osborne Association is named for Thomas Mott Osborne. Now, his tenure at Sing Sing was very brief, only about maybe 3 years, not even consecutively, because he was so progressive and so effective in his changes that the officials in Albany became a little nervous with his influence and removed him as the warden at Sing Sing. But before he was removed, he established something called the Mutual Welfare League. Do good, make good. The Mutual Welfare League was a system of self-government in the prison. The prisoners drafted their own constitution, their own bylaws. They had their own disciplinary rules, their own currency, and the level of violence and the level of conflict between the prisoners with each other, and also conflict with the prison workers, went down dramatically. And Osborne really believed that if you gave prisoners something to do and something meaningful in their lives, that they could be rehabilitated. And there was a band that was established. He created more jobs for prisoners, and some of his writings are still available. And his one question, shall our prisons be scrap heaps or human repair shops, is still a question that we continue to ask today. It's a timeless question and still a timely one. Soon after Osborne was removed from as warden, Lewis Laws became the warden at Sing Sing, and Lewis Laws became a national celebrity. His picture was on the cover of Time magazine. He was also a sort of a closet screenwriter. And so as movies became more popular in the 1920s, Lewis Laws wrote screenplays and actually became good friends with Harry Warner from the Warner Brothers. And he wrote a screenplay for 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, which was based on his memoir. And also many of the scenes in that movie, which stars Jimmy Cagney, were filmed in the prison itself. Laws gave the movie studio free rein, and in fact, some of the men who were incarcerated had parts as extras in the movie. This building on the right of the cell block here is a gymnasium that was built by Warner Brothers for the prison. This was in the 1934. As a thank you to Sing Sing, Warner Brothers built this rather handsome building. It looks like a movie studio, doesn't it? It looks a little bit like a movie studio. Whoop. The gymnasium is no longer in use, but it's a very sturdy, handsome building. It has some roof leaks. It's not part of our plan for the museum initially, but we may expand because of its proximity to the cell block. Lewis Laws expanded some of Osborne's ideas, and for example, the New York Yankees used to come up to Sing Sing and have exhibition games. And the legend is that Babe Ruth hit his longest home run at Sing Sing, and there's enough corroboration. As a historian, I'm always a little skeptical, but I think this is possibly true. And the expression, I think the Sing Sing prisoners called themselves the Black Sheep. Their team name was the Black Sheep, and they said, "Come anytime, we always play at home." So that was their little gallows humor there. In the 1920s, Lewis Laws was able to secure enough funding to finally expand the prison and build more modern buildings, and the cell block that I showed you earlier was taken out of use in the 1920s. But that was 100 years where that was the main residential building at Sing Sing Prison. In 1940, a totally different look, although the cell block was still there, right here. It was now used as a warehouse space and for light manufacturing. But in the early 1980s, there was a fire, and the roof was destroyed, but the rest of the building, as you see, is still there. Sing Sing today, there is a maximum security prison. It has 1,700 men incarcerated there, 650 correctional officers. They receive right now about 3,000 visitors. Because it's so convenient to New York City, the train station in Ossining is about a 10 or 15 minute walk from the prison. So you can go to Grand Central Terminal or there's a stop up in Harlem, and you can be at Sing Sing in about half hour or 45 minutes. So it is a regular visitation goes on there. 63% of the men there have been convicted of a violent crime. Nearly 25% have a mental illness. 95% will be released at some point. And all of these are issues that are being discussed now. How do we treat people who probably will be released, whose sentences will be terminated at some point? 42% will return to prison. However, that number is tricky because many of the people who are recidivists, did I say that right, Maury? Recidivists go back to jail because of parole violations rather than new crimes. And so we have to always look at the data very carefully to figure out why people are going back into prison. There are 400 volunteers there, and I'll just mention two programs that I think are really impressive. One is Rehabilitation Through the Arts, which is about 20 years old now and produces theatrical works where the prisoners are the main actors. And last year I saw Of Mice and Men, performed mostly by prisoners. They perform Shakespeare, Greek tragedies. It's a very important program, and their alumni, many of them, because it's very hard to get jobs when you get out of prison. The entertainment industry and the theater industry in New York regularly will hire people who have had some experience with this theater program in the prison. Another program that's very successful is called Hudson Link for Higher Education in Prison. And the director of that program is a member of the Sing Sing Prison Museum Board. And we work very closely with this program. And we envision that when the museum opens, some of the graduates of this program may want to have positions at the museum. Now, I'll just say a few words about the museum itself. Our goal, we have 4 goals. One is to be the best prison museum in the world, and we think we can do that. The second goal is to be a part of this national conversation on criminal justice. The third goal is to have a positive impact on the local economy of Ossining, because Ossining it's in Westchester County, which is a very wealthy county, but Ossining is not a very, very wealthy community. So tourism could have a positive impact on the economic life of the community. And the fourth goal is to have a positive impact on the men who are incarcerated, their families, prison workers, victims, and their families. And we have a number of stakeholders who are interested in what we're doing. So the powerhouse, I'll go back here. What you're looking at is the 1936 powerhouse. This building actually stands outside the prison walls. And this is about a 5-minute walk from the train station. This will be the main building for exhibit galleries, for theaters, for conference space, for classrooms. And so this will be the building that everyone will come to on their way for the museum experience. We have worked with some architects, and we have now a new architectural firm that we're just going to announce in the next few weeks, INEAD from New York, who will help us develop this idea of the powerhouse. On the top floor of the powerhouse, we envision a meeting space so we can have small conferences. We have room for exhibit galleries. We want to display, for example, an exhibit about capital punishment. So we want to plan this museum in such a way that people will be engaged in some of the main issues that I've just been discussing with you this afternoon. And I think that we also want to recognize that Sing Sing has a place in American popular culture. So we don't want to make this totally a negative story. So we want to talk about the Warner Brothers films. In 1972, on Thanksgiving Day, Joan Baez and B.B. King performed at Sing Sing, and that concert, there's a video of that concert which is quite remarkable. So we want to showcase events like that as well. Now, this is an aerial view which gives you some sense of what the visitor experience would be. They will enter, let's see if I can, they will enter the powerhouse, and there will be exhibits and films and classrooms in the powerhouse. And then we're actually going to break into the prison. This is the prison wall here. We're going to break into the prison and build a secure corridor about 350 feet long and connect people into the cell block, the 1825 cell block. We're not going to bring people into the entire length of the cell block, so only maybe about 100 feet in, but enough of an experience where they can look out over the rest of the building. And during that time, we will, through augmented reality, through different exhibit technology, tell people what it was like for 100 years for people to live in this building. The Warner Brothers Theater, Warner Brothers Gymnasium is here. We're not going to touch that in our first phase, but this is the concept, is arrival at the powerhouse. We will ask people before they enter into that secure corridor to give up their cell phones, to give up their a little bit of their freedom, because you're actually going into a secure prison. So we want you to experience a little bit what it's like to be disconnected from the rest of the world. Another view again of the cell block, and I think you can see actually a little pad here, a concrete pad, which after the cell block was no longer used as a cell block, there was a boxing ring there. So that it became a multifunctional space. So we're going to try to tell all those stories both in the powerhouse, which you see in the background, and in the cell block itself. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we have time for questions and comments. Thank you. I should, while you're thinking of your questions, one thing that fascinates me, and I mentioned about the changes of the name of the town, the language that we use around crime and punishment has changed dramatically. So today we don't call the warden's now a superintendent. The guards are now called correctional officers. The town of Sing Sing is now called Ossining. And they didn't want to be associated with capital punishment. But for a short time, the prison changed its name to the Ossining Correctional Facility. And the town said, wait a second, we don't want to be associated with it. But in fact, there is a close relationship. Many of the people who work at Sing Sing live in Ossining. And so that is an important change. What we call prisoners is probably the biggest change. In the 19th century, they were called convicts. Then the word was inmates. Then it was prisoners. Now it is incarceration, people who are incarcerated. And even the word crime. I've been in meetings with people who are trying to abolish prisons and will not acknowledge that the word crime is the appropriate word to use. I think they use the word harm. These are interesting debates that people are having, but it all comes back to, is it possible to re-engineer someone's behavior, especially someone who has committed a violent crime, but even people who commit burglaries or bank robberies or something like that. This is a question that I hope we will address in our programs and our exhibits at the museum. So we don't want this museum to be a voyeuristic experience or an experience where you're just entertained. We really want it to be a thoughtful and provocative experience. But now I'm going to turn it back to you and see if you have any comments or questions. We're going to have the microphone, so you're Comments will be recorded for all time.
My name is
In
Kevin
perpetuity.
Clark. Just before I came here, I was watching part of the movie Black Mass, which is about Whitey Bulger. And I didn't watch the whole thing. It's a little grim. But I was thinking on the way here, knowing what it was, that personalities, he had a compelling personality. And personalities are certainly compelling in some of these crime stories or harm stories or whatever we're going to call them. Is there going to be is that going to be part of the museum, that there'll be some of the inmates, famous inmates that were there?
Oh, definitely. And I think that is one of the was one of the attractions of the press for many years, and we will definitely focus on some of the people who are notorious for their crimes, for their personalities. We can't avoid that. We don't want to celebrate or make celebrities, and I have some problems with some of the prison museums around the country where there's an Al Capone cell at Alcatraz or at Eastern State. I think we can talk about that, but I want to find a way that we don't make it a glamorous enterprise. But we have to. We have to talk about who these people were, and perhaps get into what their motivations were.
One more.
Sure.
Very quickly, does asaning have some sort of meaning in native language, or is that just a made-up word? Or?
I think it was a derivation of Sing Sing. In fact, it was at one point it was called Asa Sing, so they dropped the middle S after a while. So.
I just had a comment about how, even today things have not changed very much. Yesterday, there was a letter to the editor in our local paper regarding a situation at the local county prison where women are being abused. Mm-hmm. And it was by Stephanie Bressler. I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was a very well-written letter. And she is an advocate for prisoners and goes in there all the time. But the point is, these women are living in a situation that is completely harmful. And there was an acquittal recently, and also the prisoners locally are paid $5 an hour to work for a local company that is very wealthy, and so there's still like a ton of exploitation going on, even, regardless of the issues of mass incarceration that many races are facing in our country. So I just think, what can we do locally to improve conditions?
No, I think it's an issue. As I said at the beginning, I was largely ignorant of this history, and also how closely it affects everybody. We think that by putting people by incarcerating people, somehow the problem goes away or what they've done goes away. But all of us at some point know somebody who has been convicted of a crime or has been accused of a crime. And we may not realize it, but if we think about it enough, we probably can we are aware of that. And so I think it's an issue. And then what happens when they leave prison? How prepared are they? I've gone to a number of meetings around the city, around New York City. The Fortune Society, which is based in New York, does a lot of work with housing and training for some people who I've met have been in prison for 30 years. And they come out and they have they're given $40 to get a bus fare back or a train fare back to Manhattan, and they go right back to the same neighborhood that they came from. I don't know if that's progress.
I saw I think it was on 60 Minutes, a visit to a Dutch prison, and there happened to be a visitor from the United States, and he was the Pennsylvania person in charge of prisons in the state. They made the point that their prisons are there to prepare these people for return to society, whereas our prisons seem to be, there to protect society from these people and to punish them. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if they're at Sing Sing what the philosophy is.
Well, there is actually, when you enter the administration building, Their mission statement is I should have made a slide of that. Their mission statement is, we want to prepare the people who live here for lives that they will not come back into prison again. So that's their basic mission. And and some people have asked me, how does the Department of Corrections in New York State feel about us doing this project? I can assure you we wouldn't be this far if they weren't supportive. But they have said to us, remember, we're not in the hospitality business the way you are. So we have a different mission, and as long as you can guarantee that your visitors will not intrude in our mission, we think this is important. They think that the culture of reform that they are trying to promote at Sing Sing, that the museum would be a way to reinforce that and to broadcast it more widely around the country. In fact, they've asked us at the Powerhouse, where we say we want this to be a powerhouse of ideas, would we have space available for reentry programs for prisoners who are being released not only from Sing Sing but from other state prisons, and we think that would be a good use of some of the space we have.
Yeah.
Maury.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, Brent. Under whose auspices? What was the motivation for this? What is the resistance to it? And how are those incarcerated reacting to this?
Well, the idea for a museum at Sing Sing, I've done a little research on that. I found an article in the New York Times from 1987 proposing a museum at Sing Sing. But most recently, the local assemblywoman, Sandy Galiff, and her staff and some of her constituents renewed the idea and secured some funding from the state of New York, about $3 million, to invest in planning and the initial stabilization of the Powerhouse. So she's been a driving force. She sees this as one of her legacy projects. And as we know in government, if you have a state official who believes in something, and she has made it her mission to get this moving. Now, we realize it's going to take some private funding as well as state funding. Our initial budget for this whole project is $50 million. We want to open the Powerhouse, a preview center within the Powerhouse, at the end of 2020. And then in 2025, which will be the 200th anniversary of the historic cell block, we want to open the museum. Now, those of you who have been involved with museums, 6 years in museum time is very soon. So we've got a lot of work to do. Your other questions about who's against this, right now there's a very strong consensus in favor of this museum. The mayor of Ossining is behind it. The township supervisor is in favor. The Westchester County officials are finding capital funding for certain projects that are eligible. Nita Lowy is who's now chair of appropriations. This is in her district, so we're hoping that she can be helpful. But we're also going to have to find a few private angels who want to associate, especially with that section of the museum that is going to be an institute for criminal justice. We want to host conferences and meetings, sort of like this forum, and have John Jay College, for example, have a forum at Sing Sing, the Fortune Society, the Osborne Association. There are dozens of groups that are based in New York that could have access to the Powerhouse. But your question about how do the men feel about it? Everyone we have talked to among the prison population is very favorable to this. I think the questions, and I have met with a few young men who served time at Sing Sing, and one of them in particular was very skeptical that we were going to be able to be free to tell the whole story of the history of Sing Sing. And also, he didn't quite see the connection, the value to making change happen in the prison system by having a museum. And that's an open question. In fact, I'd ask all of you, do you see any value in the storytelling? You know, we always talk about storytelling now as an important way of understanding history and understanding our own times. we're going to be telling stories, many stories about famous people who were incarcerated there, about reformers, about various incidents that occurred there. Does the storytelling help enrich and engage and perhaps change people's attitudes? Yes.
I have an interesting story about a robbery we had at a summer house. And my daughter, we had 2 iPads, and my daughter's, mine was stolen. She still had hers. And about a week after the robbery, she said, "Mom, I got a ping on my iPad," and checked it out. And there was the man that stole our merchandise or materials.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, she called the state police and said, "I got a ping on my iPad, and the man that did the robbery lives on O'Connell Street in Waymart." So they went up there. My goodness, there was only one house there, and he had a big barn. The barn was full of bicycles, lawnmowers, many, many things that he had stolen. So anyway, they got the poor man, and he's in jail. And now we get little checks every now and then, $5. He's got a job in jail. $6, and that's the story. But anyway, the state police called my daughter Nancy Drew. She solved their...
You mentioned about whether the stories are worth telling or not. I just retired from nursing education, but I always took my students up to SCI Waymart for community health nursing, probably a similar to Sing Sing. And they were always scared to death to go. And I knew at some point they would probably be taking care of a prisoner in a hospital situation. But so, because they had these preformed ideas about what a prisoner was, and I started telling them the stories about, and this was before HIPAA regulations came out, we were allowed to look at the prison charts. And you could see probably, first of all, 60% of them were pedophiles, because that's where they placed them up there, because they're very low as far as engaging in violence, etc. But the stories of these individuals who were there, who came from terrible poverty, terrible situations, neighborhoods, families who were pimping them out, families who were having them sell drugs, et cetera, to pay for, to support the family. So by the time the students went through and they saw the different facilities and the programs that the prisoners were involved in, and also hearing the stories about how when they got out, the families, they had burnt all their bridges, and because they were coming back on parole violations because they couldn't get a job, no one would hire them. There were just so many situations. They knew that if they went back to prison, they at least had somewhere to, they weren't homeless and they were getting fed, et cetera. But the students, it did make an impact, what I saw, becoming more empathetic, or at least understanding of the situation, and not, continuing with these preconceived notions.
Well, I think this point you're making about empathy is really important. It's also, I neglected really to make much of a point about race and education and income. And it is remarkable when you go back in history and look at the profiles of the prison population at Sing Sing over time. There's you see the ethnic composition changing, so that now in American prisons, especially state prisons, there's a preponderance of people who are African American or Latino. That was not always the case, but it certainly is the case today. And there are some very interesting books about this. One that I would recommend, the new Jim Crow, which was published a couple of years ago. Very persuasive, Alexander. Brian Stevenson, who created the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, has a book out called Just Mercy, which is about capital punishment. There are several books that cover this issue. and are very influential on how we're approaching the development of the museum. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question. I was interested in your statistics, and you mentioned mental illness, but you don't mention addiction. And I've
Right.
been teaching
Yes.
writing down at the county jail for about 5 years or so, and quite a few of most of the people in my class have addiction problems. That's why they're there.
Yes.
Other than the fact that they also they're poor. They don't have bail.
Right.
So I get them, well, if they got bail, I wouldn't have a writing class. But anyway, but they don't have bail, so they lose their kids, they lose their job, they lose their apartment, and sometimes in 90 days or so,
Yeah.
they're not charged, and they're put back on the street, but they're still addicted. And so
And they're still poor. Yeah.
and they're still poor and the whole thing. But you don't have addictions on those statistics.
Yeah, no, you're right about
and
that.
I find
Yes.
that a lot of the property crime, is due to addictions.
Yes.
You need the money,
Yes.
and even some of the violence that happens in bars and whatever.
No, it's a good point.
In my opinion, you could change the local prison here and probably many other places. Just make it someplace where you could get your addictions taken care of,
Yes.
and then people would not be coming back. But then that costs money.
Yeah. Well, and it's a philosophical question, not only about money, but, feeding the addiction or making the addiction less curable, I guess. But I think that the impact on the reduction of crime would be quite noticeable. But you're right. I didn't put every statistic in there, but I'm glad you pointed that out.
Ella's been waiting. Hi, Brent. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
More of a pure museum question than philosophical prison. You said you wanted to be the best prison museum. Okay, that's always a goal, You
Yes.
want to be the best in Steamtown for Railroad Museum. I want to be best in Petersburg for Civil War. Okay, I've seen Eastern State a couple times. It's easy to beat them. Alcatraz. How are you going to beat that ride over the bay? And then London Dungeon,
Yeah.
which is more entertainment
Yeah.
than actual education, but you do, learn about hanging and beheading in London. And are you going to be using, from your stories, I'm trying to visualize the museum. From your stories, what sort of artifacts are you going to be able to bring in? Because I like 3 dimensions. I don't really like
Yes.
books on a wall.
Right.
So that's my philosophical question.
Well, we haven't selected the collection yet. We know, for example, and probably the most controversial artifact will be the electric chair itself, which still exists up at the the Corrections Academy in Albany, outside of Albany. But you'd be amazed at how many collections are in attics and in the Ossining Historical Society of uniforms, of weapons, of different objects associated with the prison experience. And I think we'll be inundated with 3-dimensional objects, as well as photographs and maps and drawings and oral histories and all the different ways that people learn in museums. So I think the artifact issue is not that doesn't trouble us. In fact, I don't think we'll have enough room for everything. That there's a number of really interesting furnishings that were made by prisoners that are in people's homes for a variety of reasons. There's one gigantic boat that was made by several prisoners that has been donated to us. And there's one story, and we've documented, we think this is true. There was one prisoner at Sing Sing who engraved the Lord's Prayer on the head of a pin. Now, he was serving for a long time, as you can imagine. But we've documented this, and the person who owns, he did 7 of these, not just one. And so that would be an interesting story to tell.
One more then to add. You will be having curators who will be handling the collection, and you will be forming a archive.
Yes, we will have curators. We have a collections committee, and I should give a notice since this is being recorded. Dana White is the village historian in Ossining. And she is a remarkable journalist, but also a great historian. And many of the images I have, in fact, most of them, come from a collection that she had put together. So I want to make sure I give her credit as well. And she heads our collections committee. Oh, yes.
Mine is more philosophical question. Capitalism or socialism, you can argue, and it's a good topic. But the moment the private prisons and for-profit motivation came in, you have to ensure an endless supply of product if you have a money-making enterprise. And unfortunately, the product is human beings. And Luzerne County, just down the road from here, was the worst example of the judicial system being corrupted by for-profit prisons. You can argue why they shouldn't be here, but they're here. How do we get rid of them?
I'll leave that question to the audience, but it will be a question that I think will definitely come up, because it's come up at every forum I've spoken at. We're giving Allison a good.
Are the prisoners that are in Sing Sing strictly violators of state crimes, or are there some federal crimes there?
I think almost all of them are violations of state crimes. Now, the Rosenbergs were a violation of federal crime.
Right.
But and I don't even know all the reasons why they wound up at Sing Sing rather than at a federal prison. I don't know the background.
Right. One of
I say, Maury's saying they didn't have a facility for execution in the federal system.
Okay.
They did later on, though. Yeah.
One other question. Are you approaching some of the foundations with regard to raising the $50 million for this museum, or the first phase?
Yes, we are. And our strategy is that the state, we hope, will come up with about half of the budget, especially for the capital improvements that will occur within the prison walls, because that still is state property. Eventually, the state will turn the powerhouse over to us. Right now, that we're going to be leasing that building, the powerhouse. But anything within the prison walls, we hope to convince the state that not out of the state corrections budget, but out of their capital budget, for the secure corridor, for the improvements, not improvements, but the exhibition within the cell block. We're not going to change the cell block at all. We're not restoring it. We just want to stabilize that building. But yes, but if you know any foundations we should approach, please, especially if someone wants to have their name on the Institute for Criminal Justice, we would do that. But no, there are many foundations, but it's a very competitive process, as you know.
When I was young, many years ago, there were relatively few female criminals, and now things have changed so much. Do you have any insight into that? Can you?
The question of why are there more?
Well, there are more, and do you know?
Well, I think that some of the comments that have been made about poverty among women, about substance abuse, about domestic violence, and that breeds more crime. These are about education or lack of education. I think that's affecting women probably more than in the past. I'm not a criminologist, so I don't want to offer opinions that I'm really not as well informed. If someone here wants to entertain that question better than I have, but that's another question that we definitely will discuss in the museum. While we're winding up, I should say that we're developing this museum as a physical space, but we also envision a virtual museum. We have a website. We will have traveling exhibits. We will have programs around Westchester County and in New York City. So the museum doesn't have to exist just in this one place. And we've already had several programs with local libraries, very similar to the one that we've had here today. And I should close by saying that we have a grant from the Westchester Community Foundation to develop a criminal justice curriculum in the high school at Ossining High School. And that those students are our visitors of the future. Any museum, probably 30 or 40% of the visitors are on school visits. So we want the students to help us plan this museum. And we've gotten tremendous cooperation from the faculty and students at Ossining High School, a very diverse student body representing all different ethnic groups. And so the students will be an integral part of the museum planning and the museum experience. Thank you all very, oh, I'm sorry.
Before we thank you, I do have a question
Oh.
that you probably can't answer, but I can't help asking it. Why do we in the United States incarcerate more people than anyone else in the world?
Well, I mean, I'm venturing out past my historical boundaries, but I think if you look at the history, starting in around 1970s, with the draconian drug laws that led to what we now call mass incarceration, and whether those were targeted at on a racial basis, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that, and how that developed in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, and even with President Clinton signing the 3 strikes and you're out, maximum mandatory sentencing, all these policies accumulated to the point now in the early 20th century where we finally recognize this is not successful. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I'm sure that you didn't mind weathering the storm to be here today. I didn't see anyone move from their seats, and it was fascinating, and we thank you for coming and staying. You have to get on the road, so we'll let you go, but thank you so much.
We're